of the Catholic missions in South Asia and has also worked on other topics related to Portuguese Empire. At the moment, Professor Županov is a senior researcher fellow at CNRS in Paris and is a former director of the Centre d'études de l'Inde et de l'Asie du Sud. Currently, she is a fellow at the Center for Social Sciences and Humanities in New Delhi. Without further ado then, I wish to hand over the space to Professor Županov to introduce and present the history hour on rival mission, rival science, Jesuits and Pietists in the 17th century to the 18th century South India. Just a note on questions, you will get an opportunity to interact with Professor Županov, and as there's a note already mentioned in the chat, I've put it in the chat box. You can type out your questions over there and we will put them forward to Professor Županov. Over to Professor.
Thank you very much, Reinaldo. Reinald, I am really honored to be invited to your seminar. I would have wished to be there rather than virtually, but these are hard times and we have to use means that are at our disposal. And okay, techniques can help connect us even when it is impossible to be connected in nature, in reality. So I would like to, yes, there is a PowerPoint and I will basically tell you when to change the slide as we go. So let me start by saying, first of all, that since not everybody, I assume not everybody in the audience are professional historians, I would briefly, very briefly, try to explain in just a few words what is acceptable procedure in our historian's craft, so that you know how we proceed, and then we can go further. So we work out of what we call primary sources, or documents, images, objects created by the historical actors that we study. And we also address so-called secondary sources, or historiography, you can call it. And that is to say, all that is written about the object of our study later on, after it happened, until the present moment. So you can have a handful of letters, for example, one of my heroes, a Jesuit missionary, Francis Xavier in India. His letters are actually published in 2 volumes. But it's actually not that many letters. Written in the 16th century from Asia, basically India and Asia. But you can have a whole multilingual library of books written about him and about his mission and about his time. So that is what we do. The historians of my kind do. They have to study all of it. The object and what happened afterwards, the afterlife of the object. So in my 2015 book called Catholic Orientalism that you mentioned, co-written with Angela Barreto-Xavier, we trace the disappearance of what we call Catholic knowledge of India under the pressure and rewriting of history. This is this 500 years of historiography or secondary sources by the Protestant and the British historiography. It is a kind of a disappearing act that we were looking at the same time while looking at the act itself. So today, or events itself. So today I want to focus on a relatively short but important moment of only half a century during the early 18th century to show how a Lutheran mission in Tranquebar, Tarangabadi in Tamil Nadu, appeared on the missionary in South India and tried and partly succeeded, at least for a while, in making the Jesuit mission in Madurai and what is called Carnatic disappear from the map of history of science. It is also a moment in which we witness acceleration of the production of archives and the general surge in quantity of written and printed materials. So my claim is that in this work is that the rivalry between Jesuit and Protestant camps contributed to the creation of the disciplines such as philology and what used to be called natural history, and today goes under different names, medicine, pharmacology, botany. Can I have a new second slide? A slide, next slide, please. Yes, this is the so-called chorographic map of Tranquebar, and it is basically a pastel-colored fantasy with some interesting information. I'm not going to go into detail of all of it, regarding the composition of the settlement, especially its religious buildings before the arrival of the Lutheran missionaries. It is not easy to see, but there are, believe me, trust me, 5 temples, 2 mosques, and 1 Portuguese church. Can I have another slide? Next slide, please. Okay, this is another map with more geographical, cartographic official display, and the Portuguese church is in the red circle. I hope you can see. So the Lutherans did not start from a scratch in 1706 when they arrived, from a scratch in the middle of the hidden temples and mosques as they presented it in their correspondence. From the start, they interacted with Christians already settled in Tranquebar and the Jesuits and their missions in the hinterland, mostly working under the Portuguese Padroado, but also with the newcomers in the field, sent just a couple of years earlier in 1699, they arrived, by the French king, and they were also Jesuits, and they had the seat in Pondicherry and in the new mission called Mission du Carnat, or Carnatic Mission, which was basically north of the Madurai mission. So the French mission had a complicated relationship with both Portuguese Padroado in Goa and with the Lutherans in Tranquebar. You can see a complicated triangle here of missionary coexistence. Now, what is striking about the Protestant and Catholic missions is that layers of historiography have created an unsurmountable distance between the two. So while Catholic mission histories tried not to even mention the presence of Protestants, Protestant historiography similarly pretended that the beginning of Christianization started with Pietists in Tranquebar. Next slide, please. So the title of one popular account by Arno Lehmann, written in 1956 and translated in English a year later and published in Madras, is symptomatically called Es began in Tranquebar, meaning it started it began in Tranquebar. Now, Protestant historiography, especially aligned with British colonial historiography of India from the late 18th century onwards, developed the habit of defining anything that smacked of Catholicism as medieval, and it was not a compliment. And we know the parsing of Indian history into periods has been the legacy of the British colonial historiography, most famously that of James Mill and the Scottish Enlightenment stadial theory of progress of humankind, in which medieval meant stagnation and static equilibrium and religious fanaticism. Next, please, slide. So when yes, it's good, okay. When the Goan Jesuit historian, Jesuit himself at that time, Teutonio de Souza, gave a title of his pioneering history of Portuguese Goa as Medieval Goa in 1979, he was following both a kind of a Marxist historical scholarship, and he was making a political statement. He was adamantly not anti-Portuguese, but anti-Portuguese historiography at that time. So what this kind of periodization meant, meaning that Goa was medieval at the time when Portuguese arrived, meant is that together with the Mughal Empire, Catholic Goa was annexed in the historiography into mainstream history, into the category of medieval, and excluded from both Enlightenment and modernity. And the wedge was planted between the history of Catholic and Protestant evangelical Christianity, which famously started with German Pietists from Halle, serving as the missionaries under the Danish king. So you see, you have medieval Catholic missions and you had modern evangelical Protestant missions. That is how it works. Now, the famous Tranquebar mission, established in 1706, as I already said, escaped the pigeonholing into the medieval, and together with its offshoot, more famous almost, Baptist mission established in 1800 in the Danish-controlled Serampore, has been extolled for their scientific interests and the introduction and extensive use of the printing press, all of which, of course, spelled modernity in capital letters. So, however, in more than one way, it is my argument, the Jesuits and the Pietists were communicating, emulating each other, reacting to each other in India, since they practically lived side by side in Tamil Nadu between 1706 and 1759. They worked among the Tamil-speaking people. They invested in studying, preaching, and writing in Tamil, and they shared local information and, very importantly, local informants. Next slide. So now there are a lot of very good scholars working on Tranquebar, no doubt. Today I cannot mention them all here. But for example, Heike Liebau, Kurt Liebau, and many others have studied Tamil and German-Danish relations in Tranquebar on the basis of various and actually really copious materials from our side of this Catholic divide. We are pretty much envious of this, so many excellent primary sources that they have at their disposal. So these were published letters of the Malabarische Correspondence, in which Malabar correspondence, in which Tamil learned men responded to Bartolomeo Ziegenbalg's call to explain Indian religion and culture. Next one, please. Next slide, please. So Ziegenbalg, the founder of the Pietist mission, translated from Tamil into German about 104 of these letters that he solicited and sent them to Halle, where they were published in the first 2 of the 9 volumes of a collection that is called Halleschen Berichte, the news from Halle, let's say, printed between 1710 and 1772. Next slide, please. This is the collection I'm talking about. Ziegenbalg has been ever since hailed as the first linguist of the Tamil language by Protestant scholarship, partly because he himself minimized the role of Catholic grammars he used for learning the language and other Jesuit texts in Tamil, which he used for his Bible translation. Next slide, please. Yes, so the frontispiece of the recently published edition of Ziegenbalg's Tamil grammar, printed in Tranquebar in 1715 and re-edited beautifully by Daniel Jayaraj, himself a historian and Protestant pastor, who mentions actually in his introduction among Ziegenbalg's sources at least 4 Jesuit grammars. And he, I don't know who decided to take for illustration of how Ziegenbalg, according to his own words, learned Tamil by drawing Tamil letters on the sand. And here it is on the frontispiece. Next slide. Yes, and the illustration itself is taken from the Dutch travel account by Philippus Baldeus, reporting on how Malabars learn writing in his true and exact description of this travel, published in Amsterdam earlier in 1672. So Ziegenbalg presented himself as having learned the language organically. And this is a fitting epithet to describe Pietist conversion and pastoral project in Tranquebar. It also reflects the conciliatory pedagogical method of the Halle orphanage, or the Pietist alma mater institution, which connected the soul, the heart, with the hand, and was geared to create a world, I quote, in which there was no distinction between thinking and feeling and knowing and doing. Next slide, please. Yes, here you can see this pedagogical institution, which was the nursery of Pietist missionaries. In many ways, it was inspired by and bracing itself to counter Jesuits, and that is why it also, in many ways, imitated Jesuits, in pedagogical methods, and most importantly, in the area of knowledge production. So here you can see their incredible library. Oh, that's incredible library. Next slide, I think it is. Yeah, next slide. Incredible, this is their incredible library. Is it? I'm not quite sure. I cannot see it. Yeah. Okay, you and I'm sorry, I have a problem with my computer right now. It doesn't work. Okay, so there is this library which still exists and is actually most of the documents are digitalized and online. So let me now draw a large map of touching points and correspondences between the two missionary projects in South India. Catholic, yes, Catholic and Pietist. Thank you for the map. It's later, but never mind. With the specific goal of looking into the scientific, in the large sense of the word, contents that the Jesuits and the Pietists searched for, collected, processed, fabricated, and employed in and for the mission, and showcased for European scientific community in the early Enlightenment period. And I will focus on philology and natural sciences, meaning medicine, botany, pharmacology, since these were two dominant missionary tools, a sort of doing things and converting people with words and with hands. So these two sciences were important in the mission in a concrete way, and they were part of symbolic instruments necessary for the display of missionary heroic power over hedonism, over heathen bodies and minds in their more propagandist reports. Now, these sciences were also missionary connection with the European academies and scientific circles preparing the Enlightenment and the imperial ideology based on distinctions between progress and backwardness. For example, missionary reports on the techniques of cloth dyeing, in particular the use of the mordants, was about knowledge that was not necessarily useful in the mission, but was useful to attract patronage and promote missionary fame of possessing secret native knowledge needed for commercial purposes. French Jesuits produced a couple of wonderful treatises on vegetable mordants. I'm not going to go into details here. These are some very famous French, like Cœur Doux missionaries. And especially these mordants were used in producing the famous indienne, these cotton pieces with steadfast and bright colors. So now this is the slide. It is on. Thank you. So this is let's start with history of the mission and cohabitation of Tamil Nadu. This map is from the Lettres édifiantes et curieuses, edifying and curious letters, very famous collection of Jesuit letters in French, although not all originally in French. And the collection was a French Jesuit propaganda for their French Jesuit missions in Asia and in Canada, with skillful appropriation of other Jesuit reports under Spanish and Portuguese padroado. There was a rift between national Jesuits at that point, specifically because of the patronage. They became bestsellers, these lettres édifiantes et curieuses, and were translated immediately, almost immediately, into German, English, and other European languages. Now, all letters went through a local Parisian editor's office and were censored and cut according to the editorial policy, which is to showcase curious and edifying stories for wider public and success of the missions. So this map is also called Jean Venant Bouchet's map. He's the Jesuit who died in Tamil Nadu in 1732 and who sent this particular map to Paris in 1719. And he was also the founder of the Mission du Carnat, or Carnatic Mission, which was a first purely French mission in India. Just before the first Lutherans arrived in Tranquebar, therefore, in 1706, according to the first letter of edifying and curious letters published in 1700, 6 years before the Tranquebar mission started, there were about, a bit of demography here, 150,000 Christians administered by 15 Jesuits and about 100 catechists in the Madurai mission, famously established in 1606 by Roberto Nobili. And the population of South India was 30 to 35 million, let's say, by 1750. So that is the setting, that is the context. Yeah, next, please. Slide, please. Yeah, next slide. Yes. As I mentioned earlier, in Tranquebar, the Pietists found upon their arrival at a Portuguese church with some 100 Portuguese, this is from their letters, who were none others than Parava merchants converted by Francis Xavier on what is called Fishery Coast in the Gulf of Mannar. And the church was supported and endowed by the Danish governor. However, these did not really belong to the Jesuit Madurai missions, and they were administered by the diocesan priests. They were in Tranquebar, but administered by the diocesan priests. And these Christians came, of course, became the first targets of the Pietist reforming efforts. The first converts were Catholics. Next slide. And so you will see a little bit of ethnography here. Historical, okay, this is, yeah, another map of Tranquebar. And okay, can I see the next one? Slide. Yeah, this is how these Portuguese, because the letters basically say there were Portuguese and Malabars. This is how the Portuguese look like. This is a Mädchen, a girl, and a boy who is reading Latin script, as you can see. And the Malabars are doing the trades, writing on the palm leaves and spinning. So this is how they were portrayed in the 18th century in a German album today preserved in Halle. Moreover, due to political upheavals, can you go to the next slide? Also, I think it's the same. I'm not quite sure. Yes, yeah, there's another ethnographic presentation. Now, they are called Portuguese, right? But they are, in fact, Christian. But they are called Portuguese because they are Christian, Catholic. Moreover, due to political upheavals and wars between the armies of Nayak of Madurai, then Marathas came in, then Mughal army in the first decades of the 18th century, there was a kind of a war situation in the hinterland. Some Christian villages or castes were left without Jesuit priests because they were being periodically expelled from the region. So Ziegenbalg wrote already in 1707 that some 80,000 Catholics asked to be admitted to the church, his church, and to be allowed to resettle in Tranquebar. He was wise enough not to let them in. What would he do with the 80,000 Catholics? Now, the point is that the Pietists came into a territory already partly Christianized, But these local Christians were not aware about Catholic-Protestant divide in Europe, because the Jesuit accommodationist policy, something like, probably something like, but not quite, enculturation today, sheltered them on purpose from this kind of knowledge of the European rift in religious matters. So the accommodation was also supposedly creating a primitive in the most pristine, in the best sense of the word, organic Christianity, untainted by the Protestant division. The Pietist missionaries, in fact, admitted in their letters that converting local Christians to the true faith was an easier task because of the pretty good Jesuit preparatio evangelica. And this foreknowledge was also important. So they prepared the Christians or the people for the true Christian conversion. But this foreknowledge was also important for their scientific knowledge acquisition. They were able to build upon the Jesuit documentation and employ Jesuit informants. Heroic narratives of Ziegenbalg's learning of Tamil by drawing letters on the sand and repeating sound after sound was perhaps the real situation. This is how he really learned Tamil. But as I mentioned, he had at his disposal a couple of generations of grammars, Tamil grammars written by the Portuguese Jesuits, especially the grammar of Baltasar da Costa and possibly that of Gaspar de Aguilar. Can I have the next slide? Okay. I think this is the grammars by Baltasar da Costa and Aguilar. Okay, this is just Costa. I cannot see the, yeah. By the time Pietists arrived there, there was also, can I see the next slide? Yes, that is Aguilar, the next second grammar I'm talking about. Next slide, please. Yeah, okay. And so by the time the Pietists arrived, there were also excellent Tamil Portuguese and Portuguese Tamil dictionaries by Antal de Proença, printed posthumously in 1679 in Ambalacatu, and Giuseppe Costanzo Beschi's dictionary, Latin Tamil, and texts were produced after the Pietist arrival. Okay, all these texts, as you can see, it's on the slides, are in the Central Library Panjim in Panjim. So you have a real treasure out there in Goa. It's not easy to access it, but that's another story. Okay. So next, yes, that is Giuseppe Costanzo Beschi's. This is Shem Baganur, that's another Jesuit institution where I found this text. Now, Pietists themselves were incredibly productive in terms of producing and collecting written and printed texts. And in the 7th year of the mission, in 1714, they had the most impressive library of printed books and manuscripts in a dozen of different languages. They even published a catalog of books in the Church of Jerusalem, the Pietist Church, and this was an incredibly polyglot and cosmopolitan library. Next slide, please. Yeah, so you can see 268 German, let's say 205 Tamil, Latin, Portuguese, Classical Greek, Hebrew, French, etc., etc. You can see there are actually also the titles were mentioned. I have made an abbreviation of all this. But interestingly, the 14 texts in Tamil written by the Jesuits are not named. They are the only ones who are not named. They are just written by Jesuits, but missionaries, but no names, which is very significant. Now, with the establishment of the printing press in 1712, the Tranquebar mission acquired a real advantage in the mission field compared to the Jesuits, no doubt. In 2 years later, in 1714, according to the catalog, the New and the Old Testament in Tamil were already printed. So, and many other catechetical books, grammars, and manuals would follow. They were printing really with an incredible cadence. Next, please. Yes, this is just one of the specimens of this printed objects, printed books. Now, the press in the long run also kidnapped from the Jesuits some of the jewels of the Jesuit philological and grammatical knowledge, such as the Grammar of the Common Tamil by Besky, and it was printed, they even printed it in Tranquebar press in 1737. Next slide. This is just to have, since I proposed Ziegenbalg's statue, let us see the Besky statue. Besky, who died in 1747 and was an Italian, absolutely genius, talented, but I would say rather genius linguist. He was a prolific writer and extraordinary philologist. It was definitely more profound philology than compared to any Pietist efforts. Because his philological approach was geared to enter into Tamil heart through poetry and mellifluous metaphorical and metonymical language. And the grammars and dictionaries were there only to help that, as were his poetic texts, such as Tembavani, inspired both by classical Tamil poetry and Torquato Tasso, and Paramartha Guruvin Kadei, a retelling or rather inventing of Tamil folk stories. Next slide, please. So this is again this treasure in Goan Panjim Central Library. Paramartha Guruvin Kadei is out there. You can read it, you lucky guys who are in Goa. It's all there. Huh? I don't know who is using it, but it's there. So Ziegenbalg, on the other hand, wanted to affect converts' minds, ratio, right? And not hearts. And he clearly wrote that he hated poetry because metaphors are conducive to undisciplined imagination and to, therefore, idolatry. And this is why reproduction of manuscripts and the printed books such as Bible, translated in Tamil and other pious literature, were considered crucial missionary weapons by the Lutheran camp, while the Jesuits were working on literary transcreations. As mentioned earlier, this was the time of political upheaval in Tamil Nadu, with Jesuits abandoning certain territories, but things were getting tough for the Jesuits on all fronts, and there was, most importantly, a mounting pressure in Rome against their accommodationist strategy. Next slide. In fact, from 1703 and the visit of the papal legate, Cardinal Charles Thomas Maillard de Tournon to Pondicherry, the so-called Malabar and Chinese rites controversies were slowly destroying Jesuit position in Rome, in Europe, and in India. Next slide, please. And the publication of the Lettres édifiantes et curieuses, edifying and curious letters, had certainly something to do, not had certainly something to do with both the French Jesuits' arrival in 1699, as I said, on the missionary scene in India, and with the beginning of the Malabar rites controversies. Next slide. This is a little bit of self-advertisement. This is an edited book on the rights controversies that I co-edited with Pierre-Antoine Fabre. And this is also the time when Jesuits desperately fought for patronage in Paris, in particular, and tried to do so by services to the scientific communities of Académie Royale, Royal Academy, and Académie des Inscriptions et Belles-Lettres, more like a literary academy, and they really stepped up their scientific research and responded to commissions from Paris to provide texts on astronomy, vegetal mordants, as I said, cash crop plants, Indian books, manuscripts, languages, grammars. In terms of medical, botanical, and pharmacological knowledge, the Jesuits and other religious orders had already, in fact, by that time, by the early 18th century, collected a huge amount of materials. That is from the 16th century onwards. Next slide, please. So I want to start backwards for a moment. For example, these are the type of jetsam and flotsam documents I worked on. You can find in the boxes or scatole in the Biblioteca Nazionale Vittorio Emanuele in Rome, National Library in Rome, that belong to Paulinus a Sancto Bartolomeo, a discalced Carmelite who stayed in Angengo for about, and then in Varapura for about 20 years. And upon return to Europe, on the eve of French Revolution, he published some of these documents in his Viaggio alle Indie Orientali, next slide, published in 1796. Next slide. Yes. Paulinus was, as I call him in one of my articles, the last Catholic missionary Orientalist. And his 20 or more printed books in Rome, in Latin mostly, only Viaggio is in Italian. Among them, the first grammar of Sanskrit, were summa of all missionary, not just discalced Carmelites, but Jesuit and Franciscan and Capuchin, of all missionary knowledge. And Jesuits, and not just missionary, Jesuits started collecting manuscripts and creating herbaria or herbals and manuscripts on astronomy, medicine, and similar sciences in the 16th century. But it was really discalced Carmelites sent by the Propaganda Fide that took over as botanists and draftsmen in the 17th century. One discalced Carmelite is in particular here interesting for us. Next slide. It is Matteo di San Giuseppe, a discalced Carmelite who was in Kerala in the mid-17th century. This is from his album called Viridarium Orientale, meaning Oriental Garden. And it was produced, he produced this album on Indian plants, and the manuscripts are scattered. This is from the French version, but most of them are, not most, but maybe the most, or the most pages, because they are in pages rather than they are not published. They're just an album, is in Florence. But he cooperated in the beginning, and according to some, even gave the idea to arch enemy in religious terms, Hendrik Adriaan van Gedeton Drakenstein, to do his Hortus Indicus Malabaricus, a very famous and published document. So you can see these are his, he was a draftsman, so he has a particular writing or particular style. And these are his religiously inspired botanical illustrations. See, Jesus is everywhere, God is everywhere. I mean, Jesus is basically everywhere. It's in the, even in the banana, if you can see the cross. So he saw Christ-like figures or crosses as embedded in nature. And there's also snakes who I couldn't bring more, couldn't discuss him here in a more detail. These are very interesting drawings that were considered also later on by scholarship as completely unscientific and just cast aside. Now, as a rule, religious and missionary orders opened also their pharmacies in the major colonial cities, Goa, Pondicherry, Mylapore, Cochin, and their preparations were a secret knowledge. We have today the books of recipes from Macau Jesuit pharmacy from the 18th century, and it is obvious that this knowledge was leaking all over. But some of these recipes made their way into Paulinus Sancto Bartolomeo's Viaggio, and but also in 1789, to go to the Protestant side now, a surgeon in Tranquebar, Theodor Ludwig Friedrich Foley, was obsessed, who was otherwise obsessed with mercury. A lot of people were obsessed with mercury. The cordial stone in Goa, prepared in Goa, is about mercury. But he was obsessed with mercury and see that especially because he was in Tamil Nadu. He praised Catholic monks and missionaries for some of their preparations. Now, the learned French Jesuits, who were initially sent under the title of King's Mathematicians for Emperor of China, more or less, in the 17th century, produced a fair number of letters and treatises also commissioned by the savants and patrons in France. And it was in particular Father Papin, who was in Chandrenagore, who wrote 2 letters in 1709 and 1711 describing Indian medical practice. And they were both in Lettres édifiantes and curieuses. And it's interesting to compare his letters with the treatise written by Johann Ernst Gründler, or maybe Ziegenbalg, because the authorship is not completely settled here, printed in Tranquebar printing press in 1712. So around the same time. Next slide, please. This is the book, The Malabar Physician, the Method of Practicing Physics among the Heathens in Malabar. And the author sent his book over, it said, to a friend in London with other treatises, just as Papin sent his for the delectation of his audience in Paris, delectation and edification. Now, the purpose of Papin's letters and Luther's treatises were more than just comparable. It was identical. And it is clear from the text that they communicated between themselves. And in general, there is no Indian medical procedure that Papin considers strange or unreasonable. And he even finds that foreign physicians have studied and adopted certain local remedies, such as the use of Bengali beans or haricots du Bengal, or it's also called red gram, next slide, or pigeon pea, or I would think it's chickpea, but okay, it's the varieties. And this is what he says. I don't know where a German surgeon who was on Dutch ships had learned that beans were good against scurvy. He ordered soup for some afflicted. He made them fried with oil and they all recovered. Obviously, there were some plenty occasions for interaction between rival missionary camps. The texts containing medical research were thus useful locally, but they were also commissioned by the superiors in Rome in order to be given as presents to the important well-wishers of missionary orders, to be printed as propaganda material in order to recruit new members for the enterprise, or even to enhance the prestige of the order. This is Catholic side, but similarly, the Tranquebar mission physician, certain Samuel Benjamin Knoll, was commissioned in 1733 a botanical collection, which he executed within the decade. Next slide. And it would have been interesting to compare this Knoll's Herbarium Vivum or Hortus Siccus, both, you know, these are names for the same kind of dry plant, dry herb collection. The one that still is extant in the University of Göttingen, with that Paulinus mentioned, seeing in Rome, made by his predecessor in Kerala, Vincenzo di Santa Caterina da Siena. But these are rather perishable items. Vincenzo's were destroyed by the French army, unfortunately, that sacked Rome in 1798. So these things disappear, you know, documents disappear, and especially this kind of documents that include dried specimens. Now, what we know about Knoll, who arrived in Tranquebar in 1732 and stayed for about 30 years, is that he established his own apothecary shop and tested local plants and substances in order to discover new, better, cheaper medicine for tropical India and for Europe, and to enhance his status as a physician and a scientist. And he did well. He became a member of the Royal Prussian Academy of Sciences in Berlin in 1740 on the basis of his work on the chemical process in the manufacture of borax. Now, in Tranquebar, he was serving as a mission physician who was also able, unlike Catholic missionaries, to charge his services and make a private fortune. In the 18th century, with so much knowledge already available and reprocessed by missionaries and their Indian middlemen, missionary texts were a mixture of known, textual, newly observed objects and words, a kind of a mixture, yes. Next one. Such was, for example, next slide, please, yes. Yes, such was, for example, Herbarium Tranquebarense, a small dictionary of Tamil simples written by Pietist missionary Christoph Theodosius Walter, who was more of a philologist. You know, what they say, they botanize in dictionaries, that's what it is, and historian, then really botanist who looked into objects. Now, in addition to commentary on Beski's grammar, that Beski didn't like, he compiled a Tamil Hebrew dictionary dabbed in antiquarian chronologies, just like any other Jesuit missionary in the same period. Now, the Herbarium Tranquebarense is still something of an enigma, but what is clear is that it is a combination of various types of knowledges, various hands, and various languages. There is here, if you can see, if you look more carefully, Tamil, Sanskrit, Latin, occasional Portuguese word, and even words in Greek. Now, the text resembles a notebook with well-spaced entries between which additional information was added, maybe afterwards, or could be added, such as the references to the printed version of Hortus Indicus Malabaricus. Now, Hortus Indicus Malabaricus, as you probably know, was itself a mixed work, constructed out of different information by different informants, among them Erava herbalists, Konkani, Brahmin Pandits, scribes and translators for Latin, Arabic, and Portuguese, and even an Italian, as I said, discussed Carmelite, Matteo di San Giuseppe, the author of Vigidarium Orientale. A brief comparison between the entries of Herbarium Tranquebarense and Hortus Indicus Malabaricus shows, actually, if you go back to the, on the slide, yes, thank you, shows that, that they were communicating imperfectly, but communicating, but that they were both based on local Tamil taxonomy of plants, slightly different from Van Rede's production produced by Konkani Brahmins, who used Devanagari to note Sanskrit, while Herbarium Tranquebarense used Granta. For example, let us take the first item, the word agati. You can see it, maybe, or in Tamil, or agasi in Granta. It is there. And the note says on the border, agati in Hortus Indicus Malabaricus. That's how the word is constructed before going into description. Next slide, please, now. Next slide. Well, I checked this word in Van Rede's edition, and this is what I found. Agati in Latin, okay. Agasta in Brahmanic language, he says it is Brahmanic language. It is Sanskrit in Devanagari, not in Granta. Obviously, there was still a lot of confusion, and this knowledge had not been stabilized. For example, a lot of Sanskrit texts written by the missionaries were recorded in Telugu and Granta in the south, and for that reason remained unstudied and unknown. I'll get I'll get back to that right here in a second. And finally, Sanskrit written in Grantha was rejected by the early British Orientalists in Bengal. They even denied that Paulinus Sancto Bartolomeo, who used Grantha, knew any Sanskrit when he published the first Sanskrit grammar in Rome at the end of the 18th century. Next slide. There were two first, the first and let's say the second Sanskrit grammar published in Rome. These are the grammars, Siddharubham and Vyakarana. And the Orientalist quest for pristine Indian philosophical knowledge rejected missionary texts, Catholic in particular, as product of religious mongrels, right? This is why it was easy for William Jones to take all the fame for himself when he famously declared that those who study Indian religion and literature have to, I'm quoting this famous saying, have to forget all that had been written on the subject before the British Orientalists like him arrived on the scene. So what are the takeaway points, as they say today, of my lecture? One is that there was a huge amount of scientific knowledge created by the Christian missionaries, who are often seen as medieval and obscurantist agents, only keen on conversion. Second, that there was a rivalry, certainly, but also cooperation between the Catholic and Protestant missionaries. It goes against the grain of historiography. And that what I presented is a tip of the iceberg, and further and continuous research needs to be done. Thank you. Reinald?
Yeah, just as Reinald gets on board, thanks for that excellent lecture. I think Reinald is there. Yeah.
Hello. Hello.
Yes, go ahead, Reinald.
Yeah, thank you so much for this excellent presentation. It was so stimulating to listen to you. And in terms of how you further complicate this field for us, I mean, I was at the moment I had to be at my desk to type it out because there's so much that's going on in this presentation that first of all to say that between these seemingly watertight historiographies, Protestant and Catholic, what is seemingly watertight you present, you work out a very comparative type of a framework where you engage in missionary experiences and historiographies. And also what we then encounter, we see bitter rivalries and entanglements between Jesuits and Pietists, and sometimes between Jesuits themselves, as you point out, that through their philological and medical works are then also aided by the technology of the printing press. And then these contribute to local mission, as well as to a global network of knowledge, by which it contributes to this knowledge production. We also see how local knowledge was repackaged for use locally, as well as for maybe a European elite market, for the European world of ideas, kind of. And so this also takes place in the context of local political, social processes that are going on over there, as well as European political and religious divisions. Who also wanted the Protestants, the Pietists and the Jesuits, both wanted them to construct their own identities, their own separate identities as Catholic and Protestant. And we see this entanglement so well. And yeah, and yet also, even then, in spite of all that we also see that locally, Jesuits and Pietists were able to borrow from each other. They were able to cooperate in spite of these divisions, or in spite of the separate identities. They were able to learn from each other, also kind of borrowing from each other's archives, each other's technologies, and over there. And so this also for us as historians in a way also enables a new dialogue about how do we approach historiography and how we approach our mission history, how we also approach a new look at our own Jesuit histories or Catholic missions, and also social histories locally. I'm not sure if I have been successful in summarizing at least some part of your lecture, which I'm sure I have missed some part of it. But thank you for this very stimulating lecture. Before I throw open this conversation for questions, as I said, I would love you if you could also further take us to this new little book, not little book, sorry, it's called a handbook, but it's about 1,000 pages long, of the Oxford Handbook Oxford Handbook to the Jesuits. Basically to see also how does such a knowledge production, how do such mission histories also fit within these larger historiographies, not only within local time, within a small space of time, but within the long durée, within a long mission history. How does that fit in, or does it, or is it right to compare, or is it not?
Yeah, great. You put on the dust jacket of the book. Yeah. First of all, I would just like to say something. If I was too quick in talking today and you didn't get all the details, I didn't even mention all the people that I quote. I mean, all the authors I relied on to write this article, Rival Mission, the article that is actually behind my presentation. I have a PDF copy for anybody who wants to have this article. It was published in Comparative Studies in Society and History, and I could easily send it to you and you can dispatch it to whoever wants it. So don't worry if you miss something. It's the article is more has more details and has a proper bibliography, because a lot of people have worked on this topic and I didn't mention them because there is no time. So that much for that. As for the second volume, this was a volume that took, well, almost 2 years of my life, let's say, because I had 40 unruly authors. I mean, excellent authors, but you have to deal with 40 people for 2 years who all pull in different directions. But Oxford Handbook gave me a particular mission, let's call it a mission, which was to make a volume that would be informative, that would be without jargon, and that would have new research. Research with a little bit of with contextualization. Obviously, every author gave his or her own take, so I couldn't control that. So you have very different articles there. I'm not going to tell you, there are some really incredible articles which I find extremely interesting. There are some less interesting articles to me, but they may be interesting to the public. But the whole idea of handbook was that you keep it in one hand and that you can have a glimpse at the whole history of the Society of Jesus. This time it looked, even for me, too big of a bite. I would do 500 years of history of an order, and I'm not an insider, I'm an outsider, so it's a challenging, it was challenging. I think there were only 3 Jesuits who contributed to the volume. Because, of course, Jesuit history is so, as you say, entangled in history of the world, of the global world, from the 16th to at least from the 16th to the end of the 18th century. Jesuit history is in every single other history of the world, and especially history of the world with its sort of global connections. Wherever there is a global connection, you can imagine that Jesuits will be there, precisely because that was their mission, to convert the whole world. So in this book, I I mean, I know it's very expensive, but I can, if you really want, I can send you certain articles. I'm permitted to do that, but not the whole book. Not until the time passes and these PDFs will be banalized and they go everywhere anyway, and the Russians will steal it. So I divided the book into 8, I think it's 8, yes, no. It's 8 parts. And the first part was, well, it's a classical division. It is not, see, there is nothing like a Goan province in the book. Goan history is you can find it in different articles, but not in one place, because that was not the way I divided the book. That would be, that was not the way it was divided. That was my concept, was rather to go in a kind of transversal way, history in a transversal way, rather than in strict chronology and strict geography. So in the first, my first 3 major articles, I would say, are on the foundation and administration. These are the foundations of the Jesuit order. And so you have this a person who has done recently really interesting, and the books are now published finally in translation, I think Princeton University Press, who did the Jesuit order, Marcus Friedrich, who really worked on constitutions and the administration of the Jesuits from the early days until its global apotheosis. And so it's the first 3 articles are basically about the foundation. Then you had spirituality and economy. That's the second part, in which, of course, this is like it's a major part of Jesuit history, is that it is really through spirituality that the Jesuits made their administration work. It is, so you have very interesting articles by Silvia Montaccio, by Federico Pallone. Okay, is it too detailed?
Professor Županov, if I can intervene, I think I must take this line from your own introduction in the book where you ask, is one world enough for the Jesuits?
No.
And I can also say, is one evening enough for all these questions? Not really.
Exactly.
And on that note, I would like to start a few questions. I would like to begin with a question from Ayana Anthony, which says, do you have any details on the pharmacy that was established by the Catholic missionaries in Cochin by Malabar? Did the missionaries stock of the whole of South India and not just Kerala as we understand it today? And also, if you can take the next question, which relates to the conflict between the Jesuits and Lutherans. It just follows below by Maria Joseph alone, or do we talk about the history of Tamil Nadu?
But the pharmacy in Cochin, I don't have I have not worked on this detail. I think there's so many young, new scholars who should take up that. This part is, unfortunately, I cannot say anything. There is, as I said, as a historian, I follow primary sources, and these primary sources have to be available. There may be available sources on pharmacy in Cochin, but they were not available to me. The only available source was pharmacy in Macau, and that has been studied already, even published. The sources have been published. So that much I cannot further.
And to the second question, is it about, does this relate more to the conflict between Jesuits and Lutherans, or is it speaks also to the history of Tamil Nadu itself? That's the second question.
This is the history of Tamil Nadu. I don't see that I'm saying anything else but history of Tamil Nadu. This is all happening in Tamil Nadu. These people, as you know, as I showed you, as I told you, there is this whole idea of Portuguese being in Tranquebar, these are not Portuguese. These are Indians, Tamils. So under these various guises of foreignness, we are actually talking about history of one place. And Jesuits were deeply rooted in that place. Of course, they had connections with other places, Tamil Nadu, Kerala, Goa. This is the Jesuit axis where information runs more quickly, more smoothly. You know, like, why do we want to cut? Why do we want to respect contemporary national borders? We don't need them really in this kind of, I mean, I'm not writing a national history. I'm not writing even a history of an order. I don't find myself as a kind of historian of Jesuits. I'm a historian of early modern Europe, and the Jesuits is one interesting case that I've been stuck doing for a long time, but it's just one case. I'm not doing any kind of, you know, when you do national history, then you end up being either apologist or enemy. This is the same thing with when you do Jesuit history. You're either apologist or antagonist, but then you don't have to look at it that way. You have to look at it in a larger perspective, in the perspective of our connected planetary system and how it's always in contact with something else. Yes, I would suggest that if you really want to look into history of Tamil Nadu and you want to place Jesuits clearly in, that's another totally totally acceptable project. I think it has to be done. It still has to be done. There are a lot of people working on it. I can see one person, Anand Amaladas, there. People are working on it. I'm not inventing hot water here, and I'm not the first, not the last, and nothing exceptional here. But you know, we know good scholarship and interesting scholarship when we meet it, when we see it, when we read it. So you don't have to immediately put everything in some sort of preconceived boxes of nationality or regionalism or whatever.
Can we take maybe a final question, because I see that one, but that's a very interesting one that is being posed by Vivek that refers to this history of rivalries or entanglements, where he asks, how did the Pietists benefit from the suppression of the Jesuits? Did the restoration of the Jesuits come as a setback to the progress of the Pietists?
Now, these are separate. This is where their history is separate. Because Pietists, as you know, they also disappeared and they were eaten up by the British Protestant movements. And they have a different history then, because then they end up being part of the British Empire, supported by the British, supported and not supported by the British Empire, but basically supported, if not, they were not hindered. So what happened to the Jesuits and their disappearance is not important for the Pietists. I'm not sure, maybe it is important, because what is important is that Pietists did convert a lot of Catholics to Protestantism. As I said, this was their first target group for conversion. And this kind of trend, as we know, I didn't do my research. I didn't do research on that in a more detailed way, but that's what happened. Especially lower castes were prone to convert to Protestantism for various reasons, their own cultural, social, economic reasons. So it is not, I would not go into, I would not say that there was an impact of the, what you can say is that some other groups profited from Jesuit, from the suppression of the Jesuits, because then Madurai became part of the different dioceses, diocesan priests. A lot of them came from Goa, if I'm correct. Mm-hmm. Some people will know better and can answer this question better. But there were different types of diocesan priests. In Pondicherry, I know that this was what was the name of that? Escapes me now. There was another missionary order that took over. One of them were Capuchins, but they are not important, but it was the Mission étrangère de Paris, who took over even all the Jesuit possessions. And luckily, some of the stuff actually were preserved because they didn't only take Jesuit possessions, they took Jesuits in. The Jesuits joined the Mission étrangère de Paris. So the French were, the French sort of recuperated Jesuits into their French ecclesiastical structure that they were trying to maintain in Pondicherry and in the surrounding missions.
Okay, can we close with one last clarification? It's not so much a question, but just a clarification from Sunny Jose, who asks, the first Sanskrit grammar produced by a missionary is by a Jesuit, Johann Hangsleden, Arnos Padri, and not Paulinus.
Yeah, but that's not the, I said published, printed. And Haxleden's, I didn't mention him, but Haxleden's grammar was certainly known by Paulinus and probably used by Paulinus. I mean, everybody uses their predecessors. So that's another story. The lineage and the borrowings between the orders themselves of the knowledge that the former missionaries collected, that is another story. And Paulinus definitely mentions Haxleden, and Haxleden manuscript has recently been found in somewhere in Italy, in a Catholic, I think, monastery. I know Paolo Aragna went there to make photos of the manuscript. So it's, I think this is clear. Printed, first printed grammar is Paulinus, but not the first written grammar.
Yeah. With this, I believe that we need to come to a close. As I already say, we need maybe more evenings, and there are a lot of respondents who say that, can we have more of Professor Županov? And we do hope that this will happen in the future for us here in South Asia.
Well, I would like to come to Goa. I would like to come to Goa.
Very much. You are very welcome to the Xavier Center. With this, I would like to hand over to the administrator of the Xavier Center, Father Anderson Fernandez.
Director of Xavier Center of Historical Research. It is my pleasant task to propose the word of thanks. Firstly, to Professor Županov for that excellent lecture, Rival Mission, Rival Science. Dear Professor Županov, your scholarship and expertise in the subject was on full display today. The Xavier Center of Historical Research is very grateful to you for accepting our invitation to give this lecture. And thanks a lot to Reinald D'Souza, a young upcoming history scholar, for moderating today's session. And thanks to all of you participants for being present, for giving your time to listen to this wonderful lecture by Professor Županov. Just before I close, I've just displayed a couple of our publications from the Xavier Center of Historical Research. These were published late last year. And so if any of you would like to further delve into Jesuit history, there's Jesuits of the Goa province, and there's also another public history of Goa. In case you would like to have them, you can always write to us at the Xavier Center. So thanks a lot to all of you. Thanks once again, Professor Županov. Thanks to Reinald, PhD scholar, and to all of you participants. Thanks a lot, and have a good day, have a good evening. God bless all of you.
Thank you.
Thank you.